Dr. N. Sreekumar is an assistant professor of philosophy in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. He is a gold medalist for MA Philosophy from the Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam. He did his MPhil and PhD in philosophy from the Central University of Hyderabad and specializes in the areas of philosophy of language, continental philosophy, and hermeneutics. He has been into the academic profession since 1995 and is taught in Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, Kerala and BITS Pilani, Rajasthan before joining the IIT Madras in 2003. Dr. Sreekumar has published articles in various journals and has presented papers in national and international seminars. Some of the courses he offers include European Philosophy, Contemporary German Philosophy, Introduction to Indian Philosophy, Philosophical Hermeneutics, Philosophy and Critical Theory, and Philosophy of Language.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series in philosophy on Phenomenology and Existentialism, part 6. In today's lecture, we are going to see the following topics. First, pre-phenomenology, which we have briefly mentioned in the last lecture, where he has published the major work Philosophy of Arithmetic, and we will be focusing more on the concept of psychologism, the anti-psychologism which was propagated by Husserl and also by Gottlob Frege. The pre-phenomenological reflections. As we have seen, the pre-phenomenological reflections was largely dominated by psychologism, because the major purpose at this particular stage for Husserl was to derive the fundamental concepts of mathematics from psychological acts. Because like any other logician of his age, Husserl also believed that psychology is so vital for understanding the process of human thinking. Being a mathematician and a logician, he was also interested to know the foundations of mathematics and logic, and he believed that the foundations of all thinking, since the foundation of all thinking can be uncovered by psychology, he can derive the fundamental concepts of mathematics and logic from psychology too. So, that was the purpose of this work, and it was, as I have mentioned earlier, criticized by Frege. Now, we will see some features of this stage, the philosophy of arithmetic. To lay scientific basis of mathematical system by means of a series of psychological and logical investigations. He believed that the foundation of mathematics can be seen in logic, and logic deals with thinking. So, naturally psychology must be more fundamental to logic, because all thinking process which takes place by means of concepts and ideas are psychological entities. So, once we have a proper understanding of psychological entities like this, we can derive, we can rather lay scientific basis of all thinking, including mathematics and logic. Then another one is to derive the fundamental concepts of arithmetic and even Euclidean geometry from certain psychological acts. Here also we can see that he is reaffirming his faith on the foundational status of psychology, because making psychology the seat of, or the basic science which deals with thinking and which will enlighten us about human thinking process. So, that is considered as the basis. And again, in this respect, to develop this philosophical position, he has been influenced by many thinkers, including Brentano, John Locke, George Berkeley, David Hume and J.S. Mill. Brentano, because of his very famous work on psychology, descriptive psychology, and particularly the concept of intentionality which Brentano develops, which was taken by Husserl and further developed to substantiate the phenomenological reflections he developed. And then Locke, Berkeley and Hume, for their empiricism and their concept of impressions, ideas and all that is given to human mind and consciousness. And finally, J.S. Mill, whose famous work on logic, where again Mill also contemplates the relationship between logic, the laws of thinking, with psychological laws. So, all these thinkers have influenced Husserl tremendously at this particular stage. So, we can now gradually see how from this stage he graduates to the next stage, the descriptive phenomenology, and finally to the transcendental stage, the transcendental phenomenology. The concept of consciousness we can see is so central for all these phases, for all the 4 phases which we have seen, because even when he was envisaging to see the foundations of logic, thinking and mathematics in psychology, consciousness is important. And when we come to the proper phenomenological stage, consciousness becomes so central and cardinal. So, here consciousness is taken as the ultimate source of concepts. It is the source of all concepts, including numbers. Numbers are mathematical entities, so which are different from other entities in this world, because the entities in this world are concrete, which are spatio-temporal, which we can see, we can experience through our sense organs and mind. But in the case of numbers, they are basically abstract entities, they are ideas, they do not belong to the same category as objects in the world. But even numbers, when we the source, so consciousness is considered as a source of all concept, including numbers. And then we can see the study of the source of our number concepts ultimately refers to consciousness. So, this is what the study of the sources of number concepts refers to consciousness. So, consciousness is again the foundation, the basics. And now the question is, how are numbers constituted by consciousness? Question he has to answer. And here a more fundamental question has to be asked in this context: what is consciousness? What is consciousness? And several answers are given to this question from different perspective, but the most important one is the psychological perspective. Psychology is a science which particularly deals with consciousness, mind, psychic events, etc., etc. So, we will see what was the answer given by psychology. Psychology, for example, considers consciousness as a describable phenomenon. Like any other phenomenon, like any other object in this world, we can describe the objects in this world. Sciences do that. So, similarly, psychology believes that consciousness is like any other entities which can be described. It has a describable function, and hence it is like a thing, like any other thing in this world, among other things in this world. And now the problem is, if consciousness is a thing, then its products like concepts and ideas are also things, because we can see that human thinking is so based on concepts and ideas. We think in terms of concepts and ideas, and these concepts and ideas essentially originate in the consciousness. And if consciousness is a thing, then its products like concepts and ideas are also things which can be described, which are describable. Now, we encounter another problem. All describable things are contingent. We can see where the things which we are able to describe in this world, they are essentially contingent. They are spatio-temporal, they have limitations and all that. So, if concepts and ideas which originate in the consciousness are also things and describable, then they are also contingent. If concepts and ideas are also things, then they are also contingent facts. Real knowledge, but then this is the central problem. If we all assume that knowledge, real objective knowledge, is based on concepts and ideas, we get knowledge through concepts and ideas. But if concepts and ideas are essentially contingent, then how can we have real knowledge from them? By means of contingent concepts and ideas, we can never achieve knowledge which is objective and real. So, here we encounter a paradox. Real knowledge cannot be based on contingent facts, and hence concepts and ideas cannot be the basis of necessary knowledge. See, the paradox is seeing it becoming more explicit here. Then we cannot treat them, concepts and ideas, as basis of necessary knowledge. This is to assert that knowledge is impossible, because without concepts and ideas we cannot have knowledge, and if concepts and ideas are contingent, they cannot produce knowledge, which ultimately means that knowledge is impossible. But this is not the case. Knowledge is not impossible, it is possible. We all have knowledge, we all gain knowledge in our day to day life, in other intellectual enterprises. So, the possibility of knowledge is assured from the very beginning. So, we have to somehow account for this possibility now, and here we can see that knowledge is based on concepts and ideas that originate in consciousness, and they are non-contingent, as consciousness is not a contingent fact. So, somehow we have to prove that, to prove the possibility of knowledge or to show that knowledge is possible, we have to somehow show that ideas and concepts are not contingent, and hence consciousness where they originate are also not contingent. Then how do we really account for this? How do we really show this, prove this, that consciousness is not contingent? The non-contingent nature of consciousness is central to phenomenological reflections. Here we can see that Husserl now sees what is the problem here. The problem here is that we try to see consciousness as a thing like other things in this world. So, once we cease to think in this line, the problem also ceases. So, here we can see that consciousness has to be separated from the world of facts which are contingent. So, we have to somehow separate consciousness from the world of facts. It belongs to a different category. We have to somehow demarcate the unique the domain of consciousness, which is different from the empirical world, or rather we can say that it is a purification of consciousness from everything factual, purification of consciousness from the factual world with which we are familiar, and this purification will give us the contents of true knowledge. This is what basic assumption of Husserl is, that the purification of, if once we are able to purify consciousness, then that will give us the content of true knowledge, because if consciousness is purified, then naturally concepts and ideas can provide us knowledge. So, this is the basic assumption, and here objects of consciousness now in this context will be necessary objects, being in the full sense of the term. They are not contingent, they cannot be contingent, they are not limited to, or they are not conditional, they are rather necessary objects, beings in the full sense of the term. And again, the grasp of beings in the full sense of the term is to grasp beings as absolutely necessary. They are not contingent at all, they are absolutely necessary. So, once we can grasp such essences, such entities, such objects which are absolutely necessary, which are not contingent at all, then the possibility of objective, necessary, true knowledge is guaranteed. The grasp of beings as absolutely necessary will lead to the grasp of essences of those beings. This stage marks one of the turning points in Husserl's thought. So, the point which we are discussing, it calls for a different perspective to see logic by separating it from psychology. So, it is here we can see the beginning of anti-psychologism dominating, predominantly we can see this, and here we have to see the different view about the role of psychology for mathematics and logic, unlike what was the common belief among logicians and philosophers and also mathematicians and Husserl. Here we can see that Frege's anti-psychologism played a major role in Frege's. I have already mentioned that Frege's criticism of Husserl's book has led Husserl to really modify his work. Now, we will see that realization that logic and psychology are fundamentally different disciplines. It is all boiling down to this point, that these two are fundamentally different disciplines. Now, let us see what is psychologism. what psychologism is. Psychologism in logic, where it is a belief that logic can be ultimately reduced to psychology, because the analysis of human thinking process is necessary to understand the nature of logical laws, because logic deals with a set of principles, a set of laws which will guide human thinking, so that we can arrive at right judgments or reasoning, or certain rules which help us to decide between right and wrong reasoning processes. But the psychological or psychologistical conception is that the analysis of human thinking process is necessary to understand the nature of logical laws, because laws of thinking are the laws of mind, essentially the laws of mind. So, logic deals with thinking, and since logic deals with thinking, laws of thinking are laws of mind. Now, traditional logic we can see is predominantly psychologistic in nature. This is because most of the traditional logicians never separated psychology entirely from logic. There is no separation of essentially conceptual aspects from the contingent psychological ones. We can see that the psychological fact is contingent, because psychology is essentially modeled after empirical sciences. It deals with the psychic phenomena. In the same fashion, physical sciences deal with physical phenomena. So, the non separation of essentially conceptual aspects, which are the domain of logic, from the contingent psychological ones is characteristic to traditional logic, and there is this is in a sense to say that the non separation of justificatory conditions from facts. Justificatory conditions are the domain of logic and facts are the domain of sciences. So, this was not done in the traditional logic by logicians. And now we will see Husserl's psychologism, because Husserl's, as we have seen at the initial phase of his career, he subscribed to a kind of psychologism where he attempted to derive the foundation from psychology. The analysis of concepts that lead to the formation of numbers. As a mathematician, he was interested to see the formation of number, what happens when number concepts are formed, and this analysis has led to psychology. These concepts presuppose certain psychical process. The formation, the number formation or the formation of number concepts presupposes certain psychical processes, and naturally Husserl was interested in them. These concepts are constructed by the psychical processes rather. This is the major point. But against this predominantly psychological viewpoint, we have Frege's thought. Frege, as we know, is a logician and mathematician. So, Frege's response to Husserl's work, or rather Husserl's psychologism, is significant in this context. Frege, as we know, was a philosopher of language, rather he was a mathematician and a logician and then a philosopher of language. He was instrumental in initiating the process of philosophy of language in the Anglo-Saxon world to a great extent, because it was he who has influenced people like Russell and Wittgenstein tremendously. Here Frege's anti-psychologism asserts that the psychical processes that happen in a private domain are purely subjective. The objection is against basing logic in psychology, because the psychical processes are definitely they belong to a private domain and are essentially subjective. But on the other hand, logical laws are not. They cannot be based on any private domain, because logic envisages a public domain, a domain which is open to all, a universal domain. We can see that Frege was a philosopher who was even termed as a Platonist when it comes to the reality of logical entities, because he was an absolutist in that sense, and he can never entertain, he will be the last one to entertain psychologism to intervene in his thought. So, separation of logic from psychology was a prerequisite for Frege for any meaningful thinking at all. And here we can see that logical and mathematical concepts are not based on sensations and mental images which are fluctuating. They cannot be based on fluctuating sensations. They should have firm basis. And what is this basis? The mental ideas are private, as we have seen. They refer to a private domain. They are private and person dependent, but logic cannot be so. Logic is not person dependent, it is universal, it is a universal science, and we cannot base our arguments on subjective and private ideas which are not essentially shareable and objective, because logic envisages a shareable domain, a universal domain, an objective domain, and this cannot be the private domain of psychology. Arguments have to be objective and should lead to objective knowledge. This is very important. They have to be objective and should lead to knowledge which is also objective, shareable and universal. Now, Husserl was influenced by this anti-psychologism of Frege tremendously. We can see that now he incorporates this psychologism in his philosophy, and now psychology is a factual. He sees psychology as a factual and empirical science. Logic is not so, it is not an empirical science, and psychology being an empirical science, all empirical laws are applicable to psychology also, or the nature of laws are similar to the empirical laws in psychology, and empirical laws we can see are formed on the basis of generalization from experience as a result of a process of induction. We know what happens in scientific theory formations, or laws are framed on the basis of observation, observing the empirical world, what happens in the empirical world, and based on this observation certain generalizations are formed. So, these generalizations from experience, the process is called induction, and this can provide you only probability and not necessity. This was the basic objection against psychologism Husserl raised. There is an element of uncertainty about empirical laws as they lack exactness, and logical laws have to be absolutely exact. Empirical laws or psychological laws cannot be exact, but logical laws have to be absolutely exact. And since psychology is an empirical or some sort of a natural science, psychological laws are natural laws which are established by induction, which we have already seen earlier, and are only probable and cannot be necessary. And logic, which is a science which deals with essential thinking, or which is a science which is supposed to guide human thinking, cannot be based on contingencies, it has to be based on necessities. Psychological laws originate from psychological facts and hence will have psychological content. Again, psychological content is a domain, it is a private domain. Psychology envisages a private domain. They presuppose the existence of mental states and hence are contingent. So, once again we cannot base necessary knowledge on contingencies. Logical laws are necessary and have a priori validity. This is very important. I have mentioned the difference between a priori and a posteriori. Logical laws they presupposes a domain which is a priori, which is not the result of observation or experience, but rather which are taken for granted, which is the basis of all experience, and logical laws are established on the basis of apodetic inner evidences, and they do not imply or presuppose the existence of any contingent fact outside. So, here we can see that the empirical laws are hypothetical, a posteriori and factual, which should not be the case with logical laws. Logical laws are a priori and they are not factual and empirical. They are necessarily certain, a priori and non-factual, as they refer to truth which is beyond the domain of spatio-temporal contingencies, and logical laws do not refer to facts. So, this is very important. So, here we can see that the construction of scientific theories presupposes logical laws which are immediately evident justificatory principles and not derivations from experience. On the other hand, psychological laws are derivations from empirical experiments, they are the result of induction, but logical laws are justificatory principle. They are presupposed by every thinking process, every observation, every derivation presuppose logical laws. So, they cannot themselves be the result of derivation and experience, they are presupposed by them and justificatory in nature. Truth cannot be relative to anything, not to person, to cultures or to species, etc. It has to be absolutely non-contingent and unconditional. This is very important. Truth is absolutely unconditional and non-contingent. The actual occurrences of judgments involves psychical acts, but the content of such judgments do not necessarily depend on any individual mind and hence is not the subject matter of psychology. They are not dependent on any individual human mind. So, the act content distinction is made by Husserl in this context. Now, the question is, before we conclude, the question is how pure consciousness grasps essences of objects. This is one of the central worries of phenomenology, how pure consciousness grasps essences which are objective. Phenomenology, both descriptive and transcendental, try to answer this. Henceforth, this is very central in phenomenological reflections. So, both the descriptive phenomenology as well as transcendental phenomenology try to answer this question. So, we will conclude here. Before that, we will have a look at what we have discussed in this particular episode. We have seen that from pre-phenomenological psychologistic reflections, the passage from pre-phenomenological psychologistic reflections to phenomenology with the anti-psychologism, which and we have seen how Frege has influenced Husserl in this context. Then a brief look at the consciousness, that is also we had today. We had seen the concept of consciousness also very briefly. We will be having a detailed discussion on this concept later. Now, students can note down some questions from this episode. Number 1, how did Husserl come to study consciousness in the first place? This refers to the transition period from pre-phenomenological phase to the descriptive phenomenological phase, how consciousness became a matter of study here. Second one, what problem did Husserl find with the psychological interpretation of consciousness as a describable phenomenon? This is very central to his anti-psychological, this is rather the beginning of his anti-psychologism, which was later supplemented by Frege. And number 3, what are the major differences between empirical laws and factual laws? This has ultimately concluded his anti-psychologism, where he differentiated the act from the content. We will see some more important issues related to this aspects in the subsequent lectures. Thank you.